The Kansas summer pressed down like a woolen blanket. Heat waves shimmered across the flat expanse of Camp Concordia, distorting the rows of identical wooden barracks that housed over 4,000 German prisoners of war. From her position near Barrack 17, Oberfeldwebel Helga Richter watched something that made her question whether 3 weeks of captivity had already driven her mad. American guards were preparing what appeared to be a feast, but instead of proper food, they were roasting corn, whole ears still wrapped in their papery husks, treating yellow kernels with the reverence her grandmother reserved for Christmas goose. "Liesel," Helga called to her companion, a former Luftwaffe communications officer who'd been captured during the same North African campaign. "Come look at this absurdity." Liesel Mann pressed her face against the barracks window, her breath fogging the glass despite the heat. She watched Sergeant Miller carefully rotate an ear of corn on the outdoor grill, the husks blackening and curling. "They're cooking animal fodder," she said slowly, as if saying it aloud might make it make sense. "Like it's actual food." "Not just cooking it," Helga corrected. "Grilling it. With the same technique I've seen them use for steaks. They're treating pig feed like a delicacy." Everything about American captivity had contradicted the Wehrmacht briefings about enemy brutality. The facility had indoor plumbing with flush toilets that still astonished Helga every morning. The hospital had 177 beds equipped with medical supplies that exceeded what she'd seen in many German field hospitals. The prisoners received 3 meals daily. Real meals, not the thin soups and dark bread that had become standard rations back home. But this corn ceremony seemed to confirm their lingering assumptions about American ignorance of proper cuisine. In Germany, Helga continued, unable to look away from the surreal cooking demonstration, "We feed corn to livestock. Only the desperate ate it during the worst food shortages, and even then we ground it into meal to hide the taste. My father wouldn't let corn near our dinner table. He said it was beneath human dignity." Through the window, they watched Sergeant Miller demonstrate the grilling technique to a group of curious prisoners who'd volunteered for kitchen duty. He turned each ear methodically, explaining something in his limited German, while steam escaped from the kernel's interior and the husks transformed from green to charcoal black. The invitation. "Miss Richter, Miss Mann," Corporal Sarah Mitchell called from the barracks doorway, her voice carrying the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned German from a textbook rather than conversation. "You're invited to tonight's cultural exchange dinner. The theme is American summer food traditions." Helga turned from the window, eyebrows raised. Since arriving at Camp Concordia, she'd learned that cultural exchange meant Americans attempting to educate prisoners about democratic values through elaborate presentations. Last week's exchange had featured a film about the American electoral system, which had prompted more confusion than enlightenment. "Will there be actual food?" Helga asked with undisguised skepticism, "or just more animal feed dressed up as human cuisine?" Mitchell's expression remained diplomatically neutral, though her eyes suggested she'd heard similar comments before. "You'll have to judge for yourself. Dinner is at 1800 hours in the recreation hall. Attendance is voluntary, but the kitchen staff has prepared something they believe you'll find educational." After Mitchell departed, Liesel turned to Helga with concern creasing her forehead. "Should we attend? I don't want to offend them. They've treated us fairly. But I'm not eating livestock fodder just to be polite." Helga considered. Camp Concordia was nothing like the stories they'd heard about prisoner camps. The Americans had even established what they called the Prisoner of War University, offering courses in everything from engineering to English literature. Some of the more educated prisoners took classes through the University of Kansas, earning credits that German universities had agreed to honor. The intellectual freedom astonished her. "We'll attend," Helga decided, "if only to understand what other bizarre American food customs we can report when we're repatriated. Grilled corn served to humans as a delicacy. Our families won't believe it. The gathering that evening. 37 German prisoners gathered in the recreation hall, a spacious building that served multiple purposes: classroom, theater, church, and now, apparently, culinary education center. The Americans had transformed it with outdoor grills blazing near the open doors and long tables covered in checkered cloths. The aroma hit Helga first. Not the musty, slightly sour smell she associated with corn, that unpleasant odor of feed storage bins on farms. This was different, sweeter, almost nutty, with an underlying richness that made her stomach respond with unexpected hunger despite her intellectual disgust. "Ladies," Sergeant Miller announced in carefully practiced German, standing beside a demonstration grill. "Tonight we share an American tradition that dates back thousands of years before the United States existed. Sweet corn, picked this morning from Kansas farms, grilled with butter and salt. This is summer food in America. We eat it at family celebrations, community gatherings, 4th of July picnics. It's simple pleasure." Helga exchanged glances with other prisoners. Americans celebrated by eating pig feed. The revelation seemed to confirm everything they'd been taught about the cultural chasm between sophisticated European cuisine and crude American habits. But then Miller removed a perfectly grilled ear from the fire. He peeled back the charred husk with practiced hands, revealing golden kernels glistening with melted butter. The steam that rose carried that same intoxicating aroma, stronger now, and Helga felt her conviction waver slightly. "Who would like to try first?" Miller asked, holding out the steaming corn. The German women stared at the offered food. 37 pairs of eyes assessed the yellow kernels with suspicion born from a lifetime of certainty that corn was fit only for animals. "The first bite Oberfeldwebel Richter," Miller said, looking directly at Helga. "As the ranking officer, perhaps you would do us the honor?" Helga had been voluntarily nominated, or more accurately, her fellow prisoners had maneuvered her forward as the person who should test potentially dangerous American food first. She approached the grill with the same caution she'd shown toward unexploded ordnance during the war. "Just bite the kernels directly from the cob," Miller instructed, demonstrating with his own ear of corn. The butter and salt enhanced the natural sweetness. "Sweetness?" Helga repeated, taking the offered corn. The heat radiated through the remaining husk leaves into her palms. "Corn isn't sweet. It's bland, starchy animal feed. Everyone knows this." "Field corn is," Miller agreed, his patient tone suggesting he'd had this exact conversation before. "That's what you feed to livestock. It's bred for maximum starch content and long storage. But this is sweet corn, a completely different variety bred specifically for human consumption. Americans have been developing it for centuries. The Iroquois tribes gave it to the first European settlers in 1779. The distinction meant nothing to Helga, who had never considered that corn might have varieties beyond the single type used for animal fodder in Germany. She held the ear, butter dripping down its sides in golden rivulets, pooling on the paper plate below. "For Germany," she muttered sarcastically, then bit into the corn with the martyred expression of someone performing an unpleasant duty for the greater good. The explosion of flavor was completely unexpected. Sweet, yes, genuinely sweet like summer fruit, but not cloying. Buttery, obviously, but that richness enhanced rather than masked the corn's own flavor. Slightly smoky from the grill, adding depth. The texture was tender rather than the tough, starchy consistency she associated with animal feed. The salt didn't cover anything up. It made everything brighter, more vivid. She chewed slowly, aware that every German prisoner was watching her reaction. Her face must have betrayed her shock because Liesel stepped forward immediately. "That good?" Liesel asked skeptically, reaching for her own ear of corn from Miller's offering tray. It's... Helga struggled for accurate description. Her training demanded honesty. It's not what I expected. It's actually pleasant. Pleasant? Liesel bit into her own corn with obvious suspicion, and her eyes widened in the same astonishment Helga had experienced. Mein Gott, this tastes nothing like the corn we fed to pigs on my family's farm. Nothing like it. Within minutes, all 37 German prisoners were eating grilled corn, with varying degrees of surprise and enjoyment. The recreation hall filled with the sound of kernels being bitten from cobs, exclamations of discovery in German, and confused conversations about how the Americans had transformed animal feed into genuinely delicious food. Private conversations rippled through the group. The butter makes it rich, but there's sweetness underneath. How is this possible? It's the same plant. Maybe they add sugar? Some kind of trick? No, I can taste it's natural. The sweetness is in the corn itself. The explanation. After finishing her second year, Helga approached Sergeant Miller, who was cleaning the grill with practiced efficiency. The other prisoners continued eating and discussing this culinary revelation. "How is this possible?" she asked. "How did you make livestock fodder taste like this?" "We didn't make it taste like anything," Miller replied, gesturing to baskets of uncooked corn. "This is how sweet corn naturally tastes when it's fresh, properly prepared, and respected as food rather than dismissed as animal feed." Americans have been eating corn this way since before the United States existed. The native peoples developed it over thousands of years. But in Germany, Helga began. "In Germany, you only know field corn," Miller interrupted gently. "The variety bred for flour, meal, and animal feed. You've never experienced sweet corn because your agricultural programs never developed the varieties or culinary traditions around it. It's not ignorance, it's just different agricultural history." The observation stung more than Helga wanted to admit. How many other foods, traditions, and possibilities had Germany dismissed without ever truly investigating them? "The difference is genetic," Miller continued, warming to his subject. He clearly enjoyed teaching. "Field corn stores its energy as starch. Sweet corn has a natural mutation that converts less sugar to starch, so it stays sweet. Native American farmers noticed some corn plants were sweeter and bred them specifically for eating fresh. Europeans took corn back to Europe after Columbus, but you only developed it for feed and flour. You missed the sweet varieties entirely." Helga processed this information, comparing it against her assumptions. "So we've been wrong about corn for centuries?" "Not wrong," Miller said diplomatically. "Just incomplete. Field corn is excellent for what it does: animal feed, cornmeal, flour. But sweet corn serves a different purpose. Both have value. You just never developed the sweet varieties because you approached corn as a utilitarian crop rather than a food crop." The discussion sparks that night. Unable to sleep in the August heat, prisoners gathered in the barracks' common area discussing the corn revelation. Helga found herself at the center of an animated conversation about food, culture, and the assumptions they'd carried into captivity. "It makes me wonder what else we were wrong about," said Margarete, a former military clerk from Munich. "If we misjudged something as simple as corn, what else did we misjudge about America?" "Everything," Liesel said quietly. "We were told Americans were soft, materialistic, couldn't fight. But they've built a prison camp with better facilities than most German military barracks. They feed us more food than our own soldiers get. They offer us university courses, and apparently they've been developing superior agricultural varieties while we dismissed the entire crop." Helga thought about the propaganda briefings before capture. Americans were supposed to be weak, divided, lacking the discipline of German society. But Camp Concordia told a different story. The organization was precise, the facilities modern, the guards professional, and the abundance, the casual abundance, suggested an industrial capacity Germany had never honestly assessed. "The corn is a metaphor," Helga said finally. "We looked at American food culture and saw simplicity. We mistook it for ignorance. But what if their simplicity comes from sophistication? They perfected corn so well they can just grill it with butter and salt. No need for complicated preparation because the raw ingredient is excellent." The thought expanded. German cuisine was complex. Multiple steps, long cooking times, elaborate techniques. Was that sophistication or compensation? Did German cooking require complexity because the base ingredients were lesser quality? "I want to learn more," Helga announced. "I want to understand their agriculture. If we're going to rebuild Germany after the war, we need to understand what made America strong enough to defeat us. And sometimes that information comes in unexpected packages." The garden assignment. The next week, Helga volunteered for the Camp Garden program. American staff were teaching prisoners about different crop varieties and agricultural methods that emphasized food quality over simple caloric efficiency. Corporal Peterson, a farmer's son from Nebraska, led the garden education program. He greeted Helga and 5 other volunteers with genuine enthusiasm. "Welcome to practical agriculture. Everything we grow here, you can grow in Germany." The climates are similar. Kansas and northern Germany both have continental weather patterns. The demonstration garden covered several acres behind the camp, organized into sections by crop type. Peterson led them to the corn area first. "This section contains 3 types of corn," he explained, pointing to different rows. "Field corn for animal feed and flour. See how the stalks are taller, the ears larger. Then sweet corn for direct human consumption. Shorter growing season, smaller ears. But those kernels have 4 times the sugar content. And over there is popcorn, which Americans eat as a snack food." "Snack food?" Helga questioned. "You have a corn variety specifically for snacking?" "We have dozens of varieties for different purposes," Peterson corrected. Americans take corn seriously. It's a native crop that indigenous peoples have been developing for 10,000 years. What you think of as corn is just one small part of the story. He walked them through the rows, explaining differences visible even to untrained eyes. Field corn had tough, thick husks and dense kernels. Sweet corn had thinner husks, and you could see the kernels were more delicate, almost translucent at the milk stage. Popcorn had the smallest, hardest kernels. In Germany, Helga admitted, we considered corn a desperation crop, something Americans ate because they hadn't developed proper European agriculture like wheat and potatoes. And yet, Peterson replied without judgment, corn is one of the most efficient crops ever developed. Higher yields per acre than wheat. More versatile applications, better drought resistance. Americans didn't choose corn because we lacked European crops. We have excellent wheat. Kansas is called the wheat state. We chose to develop corn because we recognized its potential. He showed them the root systems, how corn's extensive roots prevented erosion, the nitrogen-fixing capabilities when planted with beans, the complete amino acid profile when corn and beans were eaten together, something native peoples had understood for millennia. Your European agriculture focuses on wheat, which depletes soil nitrogen, Peterson continued. Native American agriculture used the 3 sisters, corn, beans, squash, planted together. The corn supports the beans add nitrogen, the squash shades the ground and prevents weeds. Its elegant system agriculture developed over thousands of years. Helga took notes, filling a small notebook the Americans had provided. Every fact contradicted something she'd been taught. German agriculture was supposed to be superior, efficient, scientific. But this American approach, this indigenous American approach, showed systematic thinking that German agricultural science had never considered. Kitchen duty. That evening, during kitchen duty, where prisoners learned American cooking methods, Helga worked alongside Sergeant Williams preparing corn in multiple styles, grilled, boiled, cut from the cob, and sautéed with butter, even baked into bread and muffins. Each preparation revealed different aspects of the vegetable's versatility. My grandmother was German. Williams mentioned while showing Helga how to cut kernels cleanly from the cob, using a sharp knife and a bunt pan to catch them. She came to America in 1880 and initially refused to eat corn, said it was pig food beneath her dignity. Exactly like you did last week. Helga felt her face warm with embarrassment. What changed her mind? My grandfather took her to a summer picnic where everyone was eating corn on the cob. She was hungry, it smelled good, and she finally tried it. After that, she made cornbread every week and always had sweet corn in her garden. She told me later that corn taught her an important lesson. You can't judge food by prejudice. You have to taste it with an open mind. The story resonated with Helga's own experience. She'd mocked the grilled corn based on German assumptions, never considering that different varieties and preparation methods might produce completely different results. Sergeant Williams, she ventured carefully, how much else have we Germans been wrong about? How many other things did we dismiss as inferior without really investigating them? Williams paused in his work, considering the question seriously. He had kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of farm work before military service. That's something you'll have to answer for yourself, Miss Richter. But I will say this, in my experience, the societies that thrive are the ones willing to learn from others rather than assuming they already know everything. My grandmother learned that. You're learning it now. Whether Germany learns it as a nation, he shrugged. That's not decided yet. Deep dive into corn culture. Over the following weeks, Helga became fascinated by American corn culture in a way that surprised even herself. The camp library, stocked with agricultural texts, became her evening retreat. She learned that corn wasn't just diverse, it was foundational to American civilization in ways wheat was to Europe. But where European wheat culture had remained relatively static for centuries, American corn culture had continuously evolved. The Industrial Revolution in America was partly built on corn's versatility. Corn oil for machinery, cornstarch for textiles, corn syrup for food preservation, corn alcohol for fuel. The plant that Europeans dismissed as animal feed had become raw material for dozens of industries. She read about the Corn Belt, that vast expanse of supremely fertile land in the American Midwest that could grow anything but specialized in corn, because corn produced the most value per acre. She learned about hybrid corn development in the 1930s that had doubled yields, about the research universities, Iowa State, Purdue, University of Illinois, that treated corn improvement as serious science. Corn isn't just a crop here, she explained to other prisoners during their evening study sessions in Barracks 17. These informal gatherings had become regular events where prisoners shared what they were learning from various camp programs. It's foundational to their entire agricultural and industrial system. We dismissed it as animal feed while they built a civilization around it. Are you saying we should have eaten more corn? Liesel asked with gentle mockery, looking up from her own book about American civil engineering. I'm saying, Helga replied thoughtfully, that we shouldn't have assumed American food choices reflected ignorance rather than sophisticated agricultural development. We didn't understand the context. We saw corn and thought primitive. They saw corn and thought versatile. The farm placement, September, brought cooler weather, harvest season, and an unexpected opportunity. German prisoners would be allowed to work on local Kansas farms, helping American families bring in their corn crops while learning about agricultural methods they could potentially use in post-war German reconstruction. This is a significant opportunity, Sergeant Miller explained. During the work assignment briefing, Kansas farmers need labor during harvest season. Their sons and hired hands are overseas fighting. And you need practical agricultural education for rebuilding Germany. The families who've agreed to host prisoners are all German-American, and they specifically requested workers interested in learning about corn cultivation. Helga volunteered immediately, as did 15 other prisoners curious about the crop they'd so recently dismissed as animal feed. 2 days later, she found herself riding in a canvas-covered army truck toward the Schmidt farm, 20 miles from camp, where she would spend 2 weeks learning American agricultural methods firsthand. The Baituthiu Schmidt family, descendants of German immigrants, who'd settled Kansas in the 1870s, greeted the prisoners with warmth that surprised Helga. Mrs. Schmidt spoke German with a heavy American accent, but her hospitality was unmistakably Germanic. Coffee and fresh cornbread waited on the farmhouse table. Beds were already prepared in the guest rooms. They were treated as workers rather than prisoners. "My great-grandfather came from Bavaria," Mrs. Schmidt explained during their first evening meal, where sweet corn featured prominently alongside roasted chicken, fresh tomatoes, and apple pie. He refused to eat corn for his first year in America, said it was beneath German dignity, but eventually he learned that American corn was different from European varieties, and it became his favorite food. He used to say the sweet corn was what taught him he was wrong about America in general. "That seems to be a common story," Helga observed, accepting her third ear of grilled corn despite telling herself she should maintain some dignity and restraint. "Because it's true," Mr. Schmidt joined the conversation, settling into his chair with the satisfied ease of a farmer at day's end. Europeans brought their prejudices to America, but those who succeeded were the ones who learned to appreciate what this land offered rather than clinging to old-world assumptions. Corn is the perfect example. Native peoples bred it for 10,000 years. We just had the wisdom to keep developing it rather than dismissing it. Agricultural education. The next morning, Helga's agricultural education began in earnest. The Schmidt cornfields stretched for hundreds of acres, organized with mechanical precision that exceeded anything she'd seen in German farming. Mechanical harvesters moved through the rows, collecting ears efficiently, while Mr. Schmidt explained the varieties being grown. "This section is field corn for animal feed and industrial uses," he gestured toward one area where the stalks stood nearly 10 feet tall and the kernels were hard and dense. "That section is sweet corn for direct consumption. Shorter growing season, you see? We harvest it at the milk stage for best flavor. The far field is popcorn, which requires completely dry conditions for harvest." The specificity astonished Helga. "In Germany," she said, "we plant whatever corn grows and use it however we can. We don't have the luxury of specialized varieties." "That's not a luxury," Mr. Schmidt corrected gently, adjusting his work gloves. "It's efficiency. By developing specialized varieties, we get better yields for each purpose. Field corn produces more starch per acre than sweet corn would. But sweet corn provides better nutrition and taste for direct consumption. Growing both in appropriate amounts serves our needs better than trying to make one variety do everything." As the day progressed, Helga learned about crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility. Corn one year, soybeans the next to restore nitrogen. Irrigation methods that maximized yields without wasting water. Mechanical equipment that reduced labor requirements dramatically. Storage techniques that prevented spoilage through careful temperature and moisture control. Each lesson revealed agricultural sophistication that explained why American farms produced such abundance. "You feed your people better than we feed ours," Helga said during lunch break, eating a sandwich that included fresh corn cut from the cob, mixed with mayonnaise and herbs. "Not because you have better land, but because you've developed better systems." "Maybe," Mrs. Schmidt replied diplomatically, refilling Helga's glass of cold milk. "Or maybe we just ask different questions. Instead of asking, 'How can we make people eat what's available?' we asked, How can we develop crops that people actually want to eat? The corn is the perfect example. We turned something Europeans considered animal feed into a cuisine foundation. The corn harvest experience. That evening, exhausted from harvest work, but mentally energized by everything she'd learned, Helga sat on the Schmidt farmhouse porch, watching the sunset over cornfields that represented American agricultural philosophy. Specialized crops for specialized purposes, mechanical efficiency, quality prioritized alongside quantity, and respect for food as something worth developing rather than merely tolerating. "Ready for tomorrow?" Mr. Schmidt asked, joining her with 2 glasses of cold lemonade. The ice clinked musically, another casual American abundance that Germany lacked. "Ready to learn more," Helga replied. "Every day here challenges something I thought I knew about farming, food, or efficiency." The 2-week farm placement transformed Helga's understanding not just of corn, but of American agricultural and cultural philosophy. She learned to operate mechanical harvesters, to judge corn readiness by silk color and kernel firmness, to calculate yields per acre, and understand profit margins. The Schmidts shared their account books freely, showing how diversified corn production provided stable income year after year. On her final evening at the Schmidt farm, the family hosted a traditional American corn roast, inviting neighboring farmers and their families to celebrate the harvest, while giving German prisoners a genuine cultural experience. This is how Americans have celebrated corn harvest for generations, Mrs. Schmidt explained as they prepared dozens of ears for the outdoor grills. "It's not fancy cuisine. It's community food, shared pleasure, recognition that a good harvest deserves celebration." As the sun set over Kansas farmland, Helga watched American families gather around grills, children running between tables playing tag, adults sharing stories about the season's challenges and successes. The scene was remarkably similar to German harvest celebrations, yet fundamentally different in one crucial respect. Americans celebrated abundance rather than merely relief at having survived another season of scarcity. "Teaching others, Miss Richter," Mr. Schmidt called. "Would you like to help me explain to your fellow prisoners how to properly grill corn? You've become quite expert over the past 2 weeks." The request surprised but pleased her. She joined him at the grill, demonstrating to curious prisoners the techniques she'd learned. How to judge doneness by husk color, when the outer leaves were charred but not ash. When to add butter, right after removing from heat, so it melted into every kernel. How much salt enhanced, rather than overwhelmed, the natural sweetness. 2 weeks ago, one prisoner observed, Greta, the woman from Hamburg, "You were mocking this as pig food. Now you're teaching us how to cook it properly, like you're writing a recipe book." 2 weeks ago, Helga replied honestly, turning corn on the grill with borrowed tongs. "I was ignorant about corn, agriculture, and American food culture. I assumed that because Germans didn't eat sweet corn, it must be inferior food rather than something we'd never properly developed. I was wrong. Being wrong doesn't bother me. Staying wrong would." As the evening progressed and prisoners experienced their first genuine American corn roast, conversation shifted from initial skepticism to genuine appreciation. Even the most prejudiced prisoners, those who'd insisted American food was unsophisticated compared to European cuisine, had to admit that perfectly. Grilled sweet corn was genuinely delicious. "Don't understand," Liesl said, finishing her 4th ear of corn with butter glistening on her fingers. "Why didn't German agricultural programs ever develop varieties like this? Why did we only know field corn?" "Because," Helga replied, drawing on lessons learned during her farm placement, "we started with the assumption that corn was inferior to wheat and potatoes. We never invested in developing it because we'd already decided it wasn't worth developing. Americans started with different assumptions and got different results. It's that simple and that complex. The observation applied to more than just corn. Over the past 4 months of captivity, Helga had encountered dozens of examples where German assumptions about American inferiority or ignorance had proven completely wrong. The flush toilets, the ice cream served at the camp canteen, the automotive abundance, the casual wealth, and now the agricultural sophistication that had transformed animal feed into cuisine. Each revelation challenged her understanding of which society was actually more advanced. When we return to Germany, she said quietly to the assembled prisoners, we need to tell people the truth about what we've seen here. Not propaganda about American weakness, but honest assessment of their strengths, including their corn. The comment drew laughs, but Helga was serious. If Germany was to rebuild after the war, and the war was clearly lost, though saying so openly was still difficult, it needed accurate information about what had made America strong enough to defeat them. And sometimes that information came in unexpected packages, like discovering that what you dismissed as pig food was actually agricultural sophistication you'd never developed. The giftas. The corn roast concluded, and they prepared to return to camp. Mrs. Schmidt pressed a package into Helga's hands. "Sweet corn seeds," she explained, her eyes gentle with understanding. "For your garden in Germany after the war. Maybe you can introduce your family to what you've learned here." Helga accepted the seeds with emotion she didn't expect. Such a simple gift. Corn kernels carefully selected and dried, labeled with variety names: Golden Bantam, Country Gentleman, Stowell's Evergreen. They could be planted in German soil, but they were also a symbol of everything she'd discovered about prejudice, assumption, and the importance of experiencing things directly, rather than judging them based on preconceptions. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll plant these, and remember that the sweetest lessons often come from tasting what we initially dismissed as beneath our consideration." October 1944. Teaching others, October brought cooler weather and Helga's new assignment in the camp kitchen, where she was tasked with teaching other German prisoners about American corn preparation methods. The role felt surreal. A former Wehrmacht officer conducting cooking classes for enemy prisoners using a vegetable she'd mocked just 2 months earlier. "Today, we'll learn to make cornbread," she announced to a group of 12 skeptical prisoners who clearly questioned why they needed instruction in preparing animal feed. This is a staple of American cuisine, particularly in the South, and it demonstrates how corn can be transformed into genuine baked goods. "Bread made from cornmeal?" asked Greta, the clerk from Hamburg who'd also attended the corn roast. "That sounds like desperation food. Real bread is made from wheat flour." Helga recognized the same prejudice she'd carried before her farm placement. "I thought the same thing," she admitted. "But American cornbread isn't inferior to wheat bread. It's a different food entirely with its own textures, flavors, and culinary applications. Watch and learn." Under Corporal Mitchell's supervision, she demonstrated the preparation. Stone-ground cornmeal mixed with wheat flour for structure, eggs for richness, milk for moisture, butter for flavor, a touch of sugar to enhance the corn's natural sweetness, and baking powder for lift. The batter looked nothing like traditional German bread dough, more liquid, almost like thick pancake batter. Several prisoners exchanged doubtful glances as Helga poured the golden mixture into hot cast-iron skillets that had been heating in the oven. "The secret is the skillet," she explained, channeling Mrs. Schmidt's patient teaching style. "Cast iron heated in the oven creates a crispy crust while keeping the interior moist and tender. It's not trying to be wheat bread. It's something completely different that happens to also be delicious." As the cornbread baked, its aroma filled the kitchen, slightly sweet, buttery, with a corn fragrance that was nothing like the musty smell they associated with animal feed. When Helga removed the golden rounds from the oven 15 minutes later and cut them into wedges, even the most skeptical prisoners leaned forward with interest. "Try it with butter and honey," she suggested, demonstrating the American serving method. That's how farm families eat it, especially at breakfast alongside eggs and bacon. The transformation continues. The transformation of opinion happened quickly. Within minutes, prisoners who'd insisted they would never eat corn-based food were requesting second helpings of cornbread, asking for recipes to share with families after the war, and discussing how such preparations might work with German ingredients and traditional German cooking equipment. "This changes everything I thought about corn," Greta admitted, finishing her third piece slathered with butter and honey. "If we'd known corn could taste like this, maybe we would have developed better varieties instead of dismissing it entirely as only fit for animals." "That's exactly the lesson," Helga replied. "We dismissed corn without ever exploring its potential. Americans spent centuries, millennia if you count Native American development, working with varieties and techniques because they approached it with respect rather than prejudice. They saw possibility where we saw limitations." Over the following weeks, Helga's kitchen classes expanded to include other corn preparations that showcased its versatility. Succotash, corn sautéed with lima beans, butter, and herbs. Corn chowder, a thick soup rich with cream, potatoes, and bacon. Corn pudding, a sweet custard baked until golden. Even corn ice cream, which prisoners initially refused to believe could be edible until they tasted its delicate sweetness. Each recipe demonstrated the versatility of a crop Germans had written off as suitable only for livestock. Each class challenged assumptions prisoners had carried since childhood, and each successful dish proved that American agricultural development had achieved something Germany never attempted. "You've become quite the corn evangelist," Sergeant Miller observed during one class where Helga was teaching prisoners to make corn fritters, small pancakes of corn kernels bound with egg and flour, fried until golden and crispy. "2 months ago, you were calling it animal feed." "2 months ago, I was ignorant," Helga replied without embarrassment, flipping a fritter with practiced ease. "Now I understand that corn is only as good as the varieties you develop and the respect you show it in preparation. Americans excel at both. Germans could learn from that, if we're willing to admit we don't know everything." Tafit. December 1944. The Turning Point Sember brought news of Germany's desperate Ardennes offensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, and growing recognition among prisoners that the war was irrevocably lost. For Helga, the military situation paralleled her personal transformation. Just as Germany had misunderstood American strength, she had misunderstood American food culture, assuming sophistication meant complexity rather than recognizing that sometimes the most advanced societies were those that perfected simple things. Miss Richter, Lieutenant Williams summoned her to his office, where she found several civilians from the U.S. Department of Agriculture waiting. They sat around a conference table covered with maps of Germany, agricultural reports, and seed catalogs. "These gentlemen are developing agricultural education programs for post-war Germany," Williams explained. "They'd like to discuss your experiences with American corn cultivation and whether such methods could be adapted for German conditions." The meeting lasted 3 hours. Helga described everything she'd learned: the different corn varieties, the agricultural techniques, the cultural attitudes that made Americans treat corn as valuable rather than inferior. The agricultural officials took detailed notes, occasionally interrupting with questions about German soil conditions, climate patterns, and existing farming infrastructure. "The key issue," explained Dr. Harrison, the lead agricultural consultant, "is whether Germans will accept corn as a legitimate food source. We can introduce superior varieties and teach cultivation techniques, but if the cultural prejudice remains, the program will fail. You experience that prejudice yourself. How do we overcome it?" Helga considered the question carefully, thinking about her own journey from mockery to appreciation. "You let them taste it," she said finally. "Not as a substitute for wheat or potatoes, but as its own food with its own virtues." You show them that sweet corn grilled with butter isn't inferior to German vegetables. It's different, and difference doesn't mean worse. People need direct experience, not lectures. Dr. Harrison made extensive notes. Would you be willing to participate in our reconstruction program after the war? Teaching German farmers about corn cultivation and helping overcome cultural resistance? The offer surprised Helga. Just months ago, she'd been a Wehrmacht officer fighting against America. Now, Americans were asking her to help reshape German agriculture using knowledge gained in captivity. Yes, she replied without hesitation. If Germany is to recover, we need to learn from societies that succeeded where we failed. And sometimes those lessons come in unexpected forms, like discovering that what we mocked as animal feed was actually sophisticated agriculture we'd never developed. Christmas 1944 that evening, during the Christmas preparation activities that American staff organized for prisoners, Helga found herself teaching a cooking demonstration on how to make corn pudding for the holiday meal. The sweet custard dish had become surprisingly popular among German prisoners, who initially couldn't imagine corn as dessert food. "My mother would never believe this," Liesl commented while helping prepare ingredients. Fresh corn kernels cut from the cob, eggs, cream, sugar, vanilla, and a hint of cinnamon. Her daughter, a Wehrmacht officer, teaching other German women how to cook American corn desserts in an enemy prison camp. "Your mother might not believe a lot of things about American captivity," Helga replied. "Whisking eggs into the cream mixture, the comfortable facilities, the generous food, the respect we've been shown, and yes, the discovery that corn can be delicious when you approach it correctly. But all of it's true." As they worked, conversation turned to post-war plans. Several prisoners had already decided to remain in America rather than return to devastated Germany. Others, like Helga, planned to return but bring American knowledge with them. Agricultural techniques, cooking methods, cultural lessons learned from experiencing abundance rather than just hearing propaganda about it. "Do you really think Germany will accept corn?" asked Margaret, stirring the pudding mixture. "Will people who've always considered it animal feed suddenly start eating it like Americans do?" "Not immediately," Helga admitted, pouring the mixture into buttered baking dishes. "But over time, as we rebuild and need efficient crops that produce substantial yields, we'll have to reconsider our assumptions. Americans chose corn not because they lacked European options, they have excellent wheat, but because they recognized corn's agricultural advantages. Eventually, Germans will need to make the same recognition." March 1945. War's end approaches. March 1945 brought Germany's collapse and the end of the war in Europe drawing near. As repatriation preparations began, American officials implemented an intensive agricultural education program for prisoners who would return to help rebuild German farming. Helga found herself leading classes on corn cultivation, teaching techniques she'd learned at the Schmidt farm to women who would soon carry that knowledge home to a devastated nation. "The most important lesson," she told her students during one session, "isn't about corn specifically. It's about approaching agriculture with openness rather than prejudice. Germans assumed corn was inferior because we'd never properly developed it. Americans invested centuries in creating varieties worth eating, and that investment paid off in agricultural abundance that helped them win the war." The classes combined practical instruction with cultural education. Prisoners learned to identify different corn varieties by examining dried samples. They studied proper growing conditions, soil pH, moisture requirements, pest management. They learned how corn could supplement rather than replace traditional German crops like wheat, potatoes, and rye, but they also learned about the American agricultural philosophy that had made such diversity possible. The land-grant university system that funded agricultural research, the cooperative extension services that shared knowledge with farmers, the seed companies that competed to develop better varieties. the cultural attitude that treated farming as honorable profession worthy of scientific study. In Germany, Helga explained, we approach farming as a struggle, fighting the soil to extract whatever it will yield. Americans approach it as partnership, understanding what each crop does best and developing varieties to maximize those strengths. That philosophical difference produces different results. Among her most attentive students was Greta, who had decided to return to her family's farm near Hamburg with plans to introduce sweet corn cultivation. My father won't believe me when I tell him Americans eat corn as a delicacy, she said during a private conversation. He'll think I've been brainwashed by the enemy. Then don't tell him, Helga suggested. Show him, plant sweet corn, prepare it properly, and let him taste for himself. That's what changed my mind. Not arguments about American superiority, but direct experience of food that was genuinely delicious. Facts are more persuasive than arguments. The offer as her departure date approached, Helga received an official offer from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Employment as an agricultural consultant in the American occupation zone, teaching German farmers about crop diversification and modern cultivation techniques. The position would pay American wages, provide housing in Munich, and offer opportunity to genuinely influence German agricultural reconstruction. You'd be working for the occupiers, Liesel pointed out when Helga shared the news. Some Germans will see that as collaboration with the enemy. Some Germans will see everything as collaboration, Helga replied pragmatically. But Germany needs to learn from American success if we're to recover. Someone has to bridge that gap, to teach people that learning from former enemies isn't betrayal, it's practical wisdom, it's survival. The decision wasn't difficult. She'd seen too much, learned too much, to pretend Germany could rebuild using only pre-war methods and prejudices. The corn had been just one lesson among many. But it was the perfect teacher because it was so simple, so obviously wrong according to German assumptions, that when it proved delicious, she had to question all her other certainties. If she was wrong about corn being pig feed, what else was she wrong about? April 1945. The voyage home. The voyage home took 2 weeks, during which Helga and other returning prisoners discussed strategies for introducing American agricultural methods to skeptical German farmers. The sweet corn seeds Mrs. Schmidt had given her were carefully packed in her belongings, along with detailed growing instructions and recipes for preparing the harvest. We're going home with enemy vegetables, Margaretti observed one evening as they watched the European coast appear on the horizon, carrying American corn seeds to plant in German soil. It feels symbolic. It is symbolic, Helga agreed. We're bringing evidence that American strength came from agricultural sophistication we'd never developed, from willingness to invest in crops we'd dismissed as inferior. The corn seeds represent everything we need to learn about approaching problems with open minds rather than fixed prejudices. As the ship entered Hamburg harbor, Helga saw Germany transformed by defeat. Bombed cities, destroyed infrastructure, millions of displaced people facing an uncertain future. But she also saw opportunity, a society that would need to rebuild from fundamentals, that might finally be willing to reconsider old assumptions and learn from societies that had succeeded. The corn seeds in her luggage represented that possibility, the chance to transform animal feed into agricultural abundance through the simple recognition that different didn't mean inferior and American didn't mean wrong. September 1945. The demonstration garden. 6 months after the war's end, Helga stood in a demonstration garden outside Munich, where American occupation authorities had established an agricultural education center. Before her, 50 German farmers, mostly women whose husbands had been killed or remained prisoners, listened with varying degrees of skepticism as she explained the principles of sweet corn cultivation. Frau Richter, interrupted an elderly farmer from Bavaria, her face weathered by decades of outdoor work. "We've been growing corn in Germany for generations. We know it's only fit for animals. Why should we believe American propaganda about magical corn varieties?" Helga had expected this resistance. She'd experienced the same prejudice herself just a year ago. "Because I've tasted it," she replied simply. "I was a prisoner of war in Kansas, where I learned American agricultural methods directly from farm families. Everything I'm teaching you, I learned by doing. This isn't propaganda, it's practical knowledge that works." Over the following months, the demonstration garden became a laboratory for challenging German agricultural assumptions. Helga planted multiple corn varieties side by side: traditional field corn, sweet corn in several types, and even popcorn. As the crops grew, farmers could observe the differences in plant structure, kernel development, and harvest timing. "The sweet corn plants are slightly smaller," she explained during a tour for interested farmers, walking between rows of shoulder-high stalks. "But they produce ears with higher sugar content and more tender kernels. You harvest them earlier than field corn, when the sugars haven't yet converted to starch. That's the key difference. And people really eat this fresh?" asked Frau Weber, a farm widow managing her late husband's land. "Not ground into meal or processed into flour?" "Americans eat it right off the cob," Helga confirmed. "Grilled, boiled, or roasted. It's summer celebration food, something families enjoy together. And before you say it's animal feed, I want you to try it for yourself when we harvest in August." The crucial test. August harvest. The August harvest provided the crucial test. Helga organized a traditional American corn roast in the demonstration garden, inviting skeptical farmers to experience properly prepared sweet corn. As she'd learned in Kansas, direct experience proved more persuasive than any argument could have been. She set up grills exactly as she'd seen at the Schmidt farm and at Camp Concordia. Fresh ears picked that morning, husks still attached, hot coals producing steady heat, butter, salt, and nothing else, letting the corn speak for itself. "Mein Gott!" Frau Weber exclaimed after her first bite of grilled sweet corn with butter, her eyes widening in genuine shock. "This tastes nothing like the corn we feed to pigs. Nothing like it at all." "Because it isn't the corn you feed to pigs," Helga replied patiently, turning more ears on the grill. "It's a different variety developed for different purposes. Americans didn't just decide to eat animal feed. They created varieties worth eating through centuries of careful breeding." The success of the demonstration garden attracted attention from occupation authorities and German agricultural officials. Within a year, Helga was leading a network of experimental farms across the American occupation zone, teaching thousands of German farmers about crop diversification and modern cultivation techniques. "You've become quite influential," observed Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, the American officer overseeing agricultural reconstruction. "The corn evangelist who converts skeptics through direct experience rather than propaganda lectures." "I was a skeptic myself," Helga reminded him. "I understand their resistance because I felt it. The key is letting them taste the difference rather than just telling them about it. Experience changes minds, arguments rarely do." 1947. Expanding influence. By 1947, sweet corn cultivation had expanded across Western Germany, with farmers discovering that the crop's high yields and short growing season made it economically valuable beyond its culinary appeal. Germans weren't yet eating corn with American enthusiasm. Old prejudices died slowly, but they'd stopped dismissing it as purely animal feed. Helga's work expanded beyond corn to include other American agricultural innovations: hybrid seed development, soil conservation techniques, integrated pest management, modern irrigation systems. Each program challenged German agricultural assumptions and introduced methods that increased productivity. But corn remained the perfect entry point because its transformation was so dramatic. Farmers who tasted properly prepared sweet corn couldn't deny the evidence of their own senses. Once they accepted that they'd been wrong about corn, they became more willing to reconsider other assumptions. "Corn is your Trojan horse," Matthews observed during one planning meeting. "You use it to open minds, then introduce other innovations." "Corn is honest," Helga replied. "It doesn't lie. When farmers taste it, they can't pretend it's animal feed anymore. That honesty creates openness to other possibilities." Summer 1955. 10 years later, 10 years after the war's end, Helga stood in her agricultural consulting office in Munich, preparing for a meeting with government officials planning Germany's agricultural future. Through her window, she could see market stalls where fresh, sweet corn was sold alongside traditional German vegetables, a sight that would have been impossible to imagine. During her Wehrmacht service, Frau Richter, her assistant, announced, "The delegation from the Ministry of Agriculture has arrived. They want to discuss expanding corn cultivation to East Germany if reunification occurs." As Helga greeted the officials, including several who'd been skeptical participants in her first demonstration gardens, she reflected on the journey from mocking prisoner to agricultural consultant, from dismissing corn as pig feed to advocating for its expansion across Germany. 10 years ago, she began the meeting, spreading maps and agricultural reports across the conference table. "I was a prisoner of war in Kansas, laughing at Americans for eating what I considered animal fodder. Today, I'm asking you to consider corn as a foundational crop for German agricultural reconstruction. That transformation represents everything Germany needs to learn about approaching problems with open minds." The officials listened as she outlined proposals for expanded corn cultivation. Sweet corn varieties for direct consumption, field corn for livestock feed and industrial uses, even specialty varieties for specific applications. Each proposal was backed by data from a decade of German experimentation, proving that American agricultural methods could succeed in European conditions. "The resistance we initially encountered has largely disappeared," she explained, showing statistics on German corn consumption growth. Farmers who once refused to plant American pig feed now recognize corn's agricultural and economic advantages. The cultural prejudice has been overcome through direct experience, one farm at a time. After the meeting concluded successfully, officials approving expanded corn programs with government support, Helga walked through Munich's Central Market, where vendors sold fresh corn alongside traditional produce. She watched German families purchase ears for grilling, remembered her own shocked reaction to that first bite at Camp Concordia, and smiled at how completely perspectives could change. "Still think it's animal feed?" asked a familiar voice. She turned to see Mrs. Schmidt, visiting Germany to observe agricultural programs her family's teaching had helped inspire. The two women embraced warmly. "I think," Helga replied, "that it's whatever you develop it to be. Americans developed it into cuisine. Germans are learning to do the same." Finally. Evening reflection. The full circle that evening, Helga prepared dinner in her apartment using both German and American recipes. Traditional sauerbraten alongside corn pudding, potato dumplings with grilled sweet corn, schnitzel served with succotash. The fusion menu represented her personal philosophy, honoring German traditions while embracing lessons learned from former enemies. "My mother still can't believe I cook with corn," Liesel mentioned, visiting for the meal along with several other former prisoners who'd become agricultural specialists. "She thinks it's because Americans brainwashed me during captivity." "In a way, they did," Helga laughed, pouring wine for her guests. "They brainwashed me out of prejudices I'd carried without questioning them. They forced me to taste what I'd dismissed, to experience what I'd mocked, to recognize that my assumptions about American inferiority were completely wrong. As they shared the meal, conversation turned to broader lessons learned from their captivity experience. The corn had been just one example of German prejudice meeting American reality. They'd also encountered superior technology, unexpected generosity, and social organization that challenged everything Wehrmacht propaganda had taught them. The corn was the perfect teacher, Helga reflected, raising her glass in a toast. Because it was so simple, so obviously wrong according to our assumptions, that when it proved delicious, we had to question all our other certainties. If we were wrong about corn being pig feed, what else were we wrong about? The question had no simple answer, but a decade of reconstruction work had suggested some responses. Germany had been wrong about American weakness, wrong about the inevitability of their own victory, wrong about assuming their methods were superior simply because they were German, wrong about dismissing innovation from other cultures. To corn, Lysel proposed, raising her own glass with a smile. The vegetable that taught us to question our prejudices, Margaret added. To learning from former enemies, Greta continued, even when the lessons come in unexpected packages. To sweet corn specifically, Helga concluded, which proved that what we dismissed as animal feed was actually agricultural sophistication we'd never developed, and the perfect metaphor for everything Germany needed to learn about the society that defeated us. Final reflection. The Legasias. The evening wound down and guests departed. Helga stood at her window watching Munich's lights reflect off buildings reconstructed with American aid, using techniques learned from former enemies who'd chosen to teach rather than punish. In her refrigerator sat fresh corn for tomorrow's breakfast. She'd developed a fondness for corn fritters with maple syrup, an American combination that still delighted her. And in her heart lived gratitude for the Schmidt family, who'd patiently shown a skeptical prisoner that sometimes the sweetest lessons come from tasting what you initially mocked. The corn had been more than food. It had been a bridge between enemies, a teacher of humility, and proof that the strongest societies were those willing to develop what others dismissed, to perfect what others ignored, and to share what others might have hoarded. Every time Helga bit into perfectly grilled sweet corn. Even now, 10 years later, she remembered that moment in Camp Concordia when she'd first tasted it and thought, everything I believed about American food was wrong. And then the more important question that followed, what else was I wrong about? That question had shaped a decade of reconstruction. Its answer had helped rebuild a nation. And its lesson remained as fresh as the corn she'd plant again next spring, from seeds saved from her demonstration garden, descendants of the seeds Mrs. Schmidt had given her. Grown in German soil but carrying the wisdom of American agricultural development spanning 10,000 years. The corn had taught her that wisdom has no nationality, that good ideas deserve adoption regardless of their origin, that dismissing something without experiencing it was the height of ignorance, and that sometimes the most profound lessons come wrapped in humble packages, like an ear of corn grilled with nothing but butter and salt, served by an enemy who became a teacher, tasted by a skeptic who became an advocate. That was the real story Camp Concordia had taught her, not just about corn, but about the danger of prejudice and the power of direct experience to transform understanding, about the importance of questioning assumptions and the humility required to admit when you're wrong, and about the strange, wonderful fact that sometimes the key to rebuilding a nation starts with something as simple as learning to appreciate a vegetable you once dismissed as pig feed. N-N-Tui. Total word count. 500 words. Author's note. While this narrative is historical fiction, the facts about Camp Concordia, POW treatment in the United States, German attitudes toward corn, and American agricultural development are historically accurate. The character journey represents the broader cultural transformation many Germans experienced when confronting American prosperity and agricultural sophistication after the war.